Percent of the time, I have no idea what I'm talking about.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
It's not. It
Gets the people going.
You're now listening to Diagnonsense.
Look at all this damage!
With Justin Pendergrass and Kurt Honak.
You are a sad, strange little man.
Then we would just be idiots saying nonsense.
Maybe it's diet. Maybe it's a dietary thing. It's not anything to do with me.
Kurt's triggered. That is 10 seconds into recording.
10 seconds in. It could be a dietary thing, though. You might need to get that checked out.
Okay. Is it working?
You're working.
Yeah, that was a good soft open.
Yeah, we're killing it.
Yep.
What did you want to talk about?
No idea.
Nope.
We haven't even started that conversation yet.
You wanted to talk about, I thought you wanted to talk about trainings.
Oh, dude, okay. Kurt,
Yeah.
have you ever been in a training with people who are like, they're knowledgeable enough to be in the training, but they're the people who just carry on continuously
Yeah.
and just keep talking about something even when the trainers answer their question?
I feel like that's summer college.
That,
Or maybe a lot.
that is
Maybe a
that
lot
is
of college.
a lot of college. There's always that one guy.
Right. It's like
If you're that guy, don't be that guy.
they love hearing themselves talk.
Well, it's
Just enough to where it just doesn't end. And it's like we're at this boring piece in the training where like I'd like to get through it, and then they continuously talk.
No, I
for,
think
like-
it's a validation thing, though.
Is it?
It's a validation thing because they want, because all they're doing at that point is just rephrasing what the instructor is saying.
Oh, like look at me.
Right.
Yeah, I do that.
You know, like at least
No.
in like college, it's just like they're not adding anything to the conversation.
That's
they just
what I'm
want
talking
they want
about.
the
Okay.
instructor to validate that they agree with the instructor or have the same opinion or know how to talk at a certain, like, you know.
There should be like a college etiquette class, like how to be
It's called
in
high
college.
school.
Yeah, well, that's true. You had 12 years to figure it out. If you can't,
I mean, you have 12
you have-
years. I feel like
if
I
you haven't
still
figured it out.
I feel like I still wasn't prepared for college though going in. Like freshman year, I failed a class. I only failed 2 classes in college. One of them was my first year freshman semester. I
Wow.
just bombed it. I had like 3 C's, an F, and an A, and the A was in public speaking. And now look what happened to me.
Yeah, that's true. You're not
Now
even
I'm
speaking
sitting here
in public.
talking to you.
You're
in a
hiding
locked
behind a
room.
microphone in a closet. We're not in a closet.
We're not. Kurt is monopolizing my time again.
Kurt,
That's
are you
cool.
exiting? We are live.
Kurt?
Kurt just exits the
live-
room right in the middle of our podcast.
Man,
Good for
great
him.
soft open.
Yep.
4 minutes into the soft open.
That's a lot of good information, though. We can find stuff in there. That's good.
Or we can just talk about trial by combat again, honestly.
That's probably why that one's getting the most views.
It was the trial by combat?
Yep. And we had a cop in here. He wasn't advocating for trial by combat, but I didn't hear him say no.
I think he should have. I think Officer Hellman needs to take the initiative and advocate for trial. You should be sorry, Kurt. You should be sorry.
Yeah, bro.
Do you think I just get paid to sit here?
Put that on. You might want to silence that phone.
I did.
Like the
Shut
movie
it
theater,
off.
bro. Thank you
Sorry.
guys for tuning into Diagnonsense.
That's
I'm your
what we're
host,
doing?
Justin Pendergrass.
Right?
It's just
and I'm
one of
here
those
with my
days.
co-host, Kurt Honak. How you doing, Kurt?
I'm doing great.
Yeah, we're going to throw it over to Isaac for some quick housekeeping. We obviously are not on the same page
I'm so
today.
frazzled.
Let's just roll out. Let's go.
Housekeeping, okay. There's a prescription drug take-back on the 30th of April, I believe at Fred Meyer. Good program. If you have a
Who's
bunch
doing
of...
that? Fred
I
Myers?
think it's just at Fred Meyer's, although
Interesting.
I'll have to confirm that with Michelle. But yeah, never a bad idea to just get the excess opioids out of the house.
It's definitely a safe alternative.
It's a safe, yeah, for sure. Safe alternative as opposed to them just sitting in your cabinet waiting
Yeah.
for someone to take them, you know.
Waiting for
child.
somebody to see them that
Exactly.
doesn't need them.
Exactly.
Kurt's in there. He's like, "What are these? Get these out of here! This is Kurt's
Where's
holiday.
Rachel?
This is his Christmas. Prescription drug take back day."
Kurt's like the opposite of, he's like prescription drug anti-Santa. He just goes around down the chimney and he takes all your prescription drugs out of your house and back up the
Do
chimney.
it, Kurt.
That's terrifying.
I'm
That's like
I'm
what's that
advocating
movie?
for this.
What's that movie?
Krampus?
It's like Krampus or something.
What is it? Krampus?
Prescription drug Krampus, Kurt Honak. I need someone that's better at
Yes.
Photoshop than me to do that.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
terrifying because I'm like 6'5", so that's I wouldn't want to see me in the dark.
Dang.
What is this? A housekeeping section?
No idea.
Listen to our podcast. We have lots of podcasts that are coming
Yeah,
out.
what a weird way to roll in today.
This is, I've got bad juju already from this episode. I got some weird vibes. I feel like we have, like last week, we had our first guest with Diagnonsense, and that was like, are we going to get any higher than that?
Probably not.
I
So
don't think
actually,
so.
people are like really loving that one because I think that it was just a really good community-based like resource segment, kind of with the officer just sharing what's going out on the streets with the fentanyl stuff, and then me and Kurt just getting to hear his heart on what he's dealing with as an officer of the law who deal with crazy mental health stuff. We're crazy if we think they don't.
We're definitely going to have Officer Hellman back on here down the road because I think we
Yes.
can dive way deeper into that. We only really scratched
For
the
sure.
surface with that
Yeah.
episode too.
How did you feel about it, Kurt?
I felt great about it. I'd love to see people in our community doing great things. One of the things that I feel like I missed an opportunity to talk about though was when we're talking about the polypharmacy section because I when we're talking about the efficacy, one of the things I said was I don't feel like there's very much research on polypharmacy, but I mean specifically in the efficacy context, right? And so
Yeah, elaborate on that. For
I feel like I missed an opportunity there a little bit because I've been, with my story, I've been following different studies that have been coming out and research that has been coming out since that's in the past decade, because that's really when I started to look at pharmaceuticals more critically. And I want to say the ones that I've seen, I don't think they look good. There's this one that was released in 2016 that I found it on. So I found it on Rehabs. It's Rehabs, American Addiction Centers, National Rehabs Directory, and there's a study here that's talking about the headline of the study is psychiatric medications kill more Americans than heroin. And it's just talking about basically polypharmacy. And that, so in 2014, it says 10,574 people died of heroin overdoses, while 15,778 died from overdoses on psychiatric meds. It says nearly 50% more. So, when we were talking about that, I wanted to just touch base that, and I didn't feel like it was probably the right time for it with it where we had a guest, but that, it's not that there's not research out there. It's just that the efficacy, I don't see the efficacy in the research. Like, I don't see where it's good. I mean, I'd love for somebody to send me something that says something different, but
Right, that's
the
what
stuff
you're
that I'm
reading.
reading is not good. And I felt like I should have elaborated on that more.
And anytime we have an article, the link's in the description because Kurt's in college, so he keeps sending me these citations, and I was like, man, I thought I like dodged APA format, and it's like, man, APA format
coming
got
back
hands.
to
It
haunt
just
you.
keeps coming back.
It's ghost.
But yeah, so for people that are
Ghosted
more interested, like to do their own research and look at what we're talking about in full detail, we're always putting those links in the descriptions, which
Yeah,
same
please
with this
check them
article.
out.
I'm going to send you this one, Isaac, so it can be posted on this episode. But
Yeah, definitely. Give me some brief overviews of that stuff, Kurt, because I do want to actually talk to you about this. This is something that you'd mentioned to me that you wish that you would have said. So I wanted to make it a big point for us to actually have that conversation first. What you were really trying to point out, and really how you feel about it is what I'm asking.
right. I mean, I feel like I just don't feel like it's being appropriately represented. I mean, if you look at, This is back in what 2016, but
Yeah.
or wait, no, 2014 here. So we got 2014. I mean, that was in 2014, so that wasn't that that wasn't even that recent. That was 6-7 years ago.
8 years ago.
8 years ago
Yeah.
now. Jeez, yeah.
I'd like to see if they did another article more recently, because that was also kind of like the first wave of the opioid epidemic,
Yeah.
2014, and then that spike was, I think it was like 17 or 18,
Yeah.
somewhere in there, where it really started
Right.
spiking.
And I was having conversations with Michael Carson, and we were just talking about, like, this is just the tip of the iceberg for the opioid epidemic too. You know, we won't see this. This will take maybe like generations of damage. And I just, so my feelings on this were just like, man, it's not getting the news coverage. Like, when do we ever hear we hear stories about heroin and opioid deaths and fentanyl overdoses all the time, but we never hear about the psychiatric side of that. And so that's frustrating for me, because as a person who went through, 16 years of having different drugs tried out on me, and then feeling like, okay, I feel like that wasn't the solution, and I feel like that made me worse in a lot of cases. Like, seeing the deaths tally up from that, and knowing there's people in post-acute withdrawal, knowing there's people struggling with suicide who, because they've been exposed to a substance for so long, just have a hard time functioning, is frustrating to see in the news. There's just no coverage of that. I feel like,
Yeah, no, that's valid. It does. I think that there's a lot of different angles that this conversation needs to be approached in, especially with that, because what you're saying is that it's not, no one's asking the questions of what about not meds, right, and it doesn't feel like that's actually being pushed out enough. And I'm with you, man. I'm with you on that conversation. I do think that we do need to be trying other solutions, or at least making the primary focus of finding things put in place so that those aren't always going to be the solution, right?
Right.
Because what you're telling me, and what you've told me in the past, is that what really helped you actually outside of medications and through your post-acute withdrawal was exercise, dietary needs, making sure that you were managing your body and what your body needs.
Right.
Outside of those things. Am I right?
Right. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, but it's that, but it's also not, it's not listening to the misinformation that, from my perspective, is misinformation, where we're going, mental illness is a chemical imbalance. And, part of the solution is, drug based. And to me, it's like, well, if I was going to get better, wouldn't I have gotten better in that 16-year span? I feel like there's so much misinformation about how to like take care of yourself, right? That it's frustrating for me to watch, and see the recovery side of this, where people are in post-acute withdrawal online, and I'm watching people like, they're just like, man, I don't know if I'm on mental health drugs, but I just don't know if I can, I don't know if I'm going to make it, because I'm just so miserable, and like not seeing that side in the news or in any of the conversations that are being had. So I felt like I had to like say something about that, because I kind of like, the question came up, and it was like, well, in terms of efficacy, yeah, no, I don't see anything there, but in terms of research being presented, it doesn't look good,
Yeah. No, and do you have other articles that are pertaining to these same conversations that we can talk about in later segments?
Yeah, I mean, I love Mad in America is a great resource, but they're pulling from studies that are being conducted all over the place. Even I've seen international studies on there, I think. So, I mean, like, they're writing articles, and they have their bent from, kind of Robert Whitaker's, because he was a journalist, right, that covered, he was covering articles for the pharmaceutical companies, and then started to discover stuff and delved further. And so it kind of, from his perspective, and his opening of Anatomy of an Epidemic just talks about, I think there's something like a 35-fold increase in disability rates from like 87 to 2005, I think is what the statistic is. And like, that's the opening of one of his books, is like talking about like, okay, so we've got people on these drugs. How come, you know, in 2014, we're seeing that we're getting more psychiatric medications killing people than heroin? And how come our disability rates have been going up for decades? Like, whereas if this is the solution to the problem, why are we not talking about this more? And, you know, that's something that I'm sure I'll find articles on and pull up more for, for us to just talk about. And because, you know, it's tough because it's such a deep subject, but we don't really, it's so complicated, right, at this point that it's hard to just talk about in like a lateral, linear fashion, you'll say.
Right. There's so many things around that. And I mean, I was in a training today and the guy was talking about how, like, you know, suicide is just a broad term, right? So that's my primary focus around here. And it's just this broad term. Like, you can't just say, oh, this individual is suicidal, because it looks differently for everyone. And just like this situation is it looks differently for everyone. And how what you're saying is that like meds aren't the answer. You're saying that what you're seeing and what you're studying is that meds aren't the answer. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
that's it's frustrating, right? Because like we know that there is anomalies out there. We know that there are this minority of people. I think from my perspective, there probably are a minority of people where that is the solution, but that's not the narrative, right? And it's frustrating because I'm at the same time, like we all know that that's been culturally ingrained in us from decades of pharmaceutical advertising, but we're not having the conversation of like, well, what happens when that's not the solution? The person's still alive, but they've been damaged from that treatment, and they're they're on the other end of it, like, how do I get out of this? Because now I'm committed to what happened to my biology, you know? So
yeah, no.
Yeah.
Well, and that's, I mean, the solution there seems to be take other steps. That your first step should never be, I'm going to go on to a drug that's going to alter my biology, right? I mean, that's it. A huge part of that is those are marketed as the first solution, and there's so many other steps you can be taking before you even start to consider that as a viable option. Right.
Well, I mean, it's like Thomas Szasz said. You know, Thomas Szasz was a Hungarian psychiatrist.
I just watched the video.
Yeah.
So
I sent you some material, but
and I want to talk about this, like, because we could talk for a whole episode just about this lecture, and I'm going to have to go back and watch it again.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
So maybe we look at it in more depth next week.
Yeah.
I'd go ahead and touch on it, because,
I want to quote him something separate from that lecture, was that he said that, Catholics called life a vale of tears, and for we've been recognizing it as like meaningful suffering, and suffering is a part of life for like thousands of years. And all of a sudden, I think the quote is, within the span of like 50 years, at the time of when he was talking about this, in the span of 50 years, we've decided that that's not part of life anymore, that that's separate. Like, suffering is separate from like inherently like existing, and like we can solve that. And it's like, I mean, that's been part of theology and part of our journeys on this life, like since the dawn of like recorded history, right? So like, I just, to me, it's frustrating. It's frustrating because I see those sides of it, but it's hard to have a conversation where I like linearly, we just like go, okay, here's what's wrong, here's the solution. Like, because it's so multifaceted.
Right. There's
too.
so many ways that, like I said, you have to come at this from multiple different angles. It can't just be one solution. It's just like when you're dealing with someone who's suicidal, it's not always one thing. It's a compound of situations. It's a compound of things that they're up against.
Yeah. And I want to touch on that idea of, suffering as a part of life. I guess my question would be, how are we going to define suffering? Because to me, where I'm coming from is suffering. I believe that suffering objectively is a part of life, in that we are always going to have hardships that occur, right? Loved ones are going to pass away.
Sure.
We're going to get turned down for X promotion. We're going to have breakups in life, like you're always going to have that aspect of suffering. I mean, for myself, coming from religious background and perspective, I would say that yes, suffering is a part of life. Now the question is, what can we do from a worldly perspective? What can we do logistically to decrease suffering or to increase quality of life? Like if we're having someone that mentally is not well, what can they do to get out of that? I mean, interacting with friends and family, diet and exercise, eating right. We can do that. That can help you. But I don't think that is going to make all the suffering in your life go away, right? You're still gonna have, grandma's still gonna pass away.
Right.
Stuff is still gonna happen to you. You're gonna have a bad day at work, but we can recontextualize that if we're in a correct headspace to go, man, that meeting at work, that training at work today was brutal, Justin.
It was a great training. It's just that first initial that one person in every training, right?
But you have that experience at work, like, man, work just sucked today. But if I'm in the right headspace, I can take that, quote unquote suffering. I mean, you can take that and you can go, you know what though? Like that's life. And I have the tools to move on from that and to grow as a person in that suffering. And maybe that's not the healthiest mindset all the time, but I grew up in team sports and in a household where it's like, you know what? Like bad stuff's going to happen to you. You're going to go down in a game. You're going to get hurt. You're going to get knocked down, but you have to get back up and you have to be able to learn from that situation. You're going to fail in life, but you have to learn from that failure. And so I agree with you in that, do we have to suffer through life? No, we don't have to suffer through life, but do we have to learn as people when we're growing up and even as adults, moving forward through different parts of our life, do we have to learn how to learn from failure, learn from suffering, and then move forward and become better people as a result? Yes. I believe that's a critical part of maturing.
Yeah.
And I think that's where that ties back in is, but first, before you can do that, you have to have the tools in your toolbox.
That's
to unpack that.
So what you're describing to me is, and I've had this conversation with Kurt, it's I'll call it purposeful pain and purposeless pain. And we get to decide what our pain is, right? When you break your arm's going to hurt until it's going to heal, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt while it's healing. And so what I have been working on and understanding and developing with Kurt over the last year is just this understanding of what purposeful pain is and what that looks like, right? We've had this conversation a couple different times, and purposeful pain is that pain that, is to help you grow. Growing pains, right? The growing pains of life. And then there's the purposeless pain. And that's when we allow the pain to not allow us to grow, right? Because you're going to run into hardships. You're going to run into struggles, and that's just a guaranteed. Some of us are going to experience more intense ones. Some of us are going to experience less intense ones. Well, I'll tell you what, I watched both of my parents attempt on their lives, which resulted in me, becoming suicidal on myself. And now I'm in a position where I got to advocate for people who are struggling with suicide. So I took my pain and I made it purposeful, right? I took the struggles that I was up against and I made them into a purposeful situation and a purposeful pain. And I think that's really what Kurt's talking about is like, we can't get to this point where we're creating our happiness, a fabricated sense of happiness, right? this
Yeah.
fabricated happiness. And what he's saying is, you know, we have to be able to understand that pain has a purpose. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's a lot more hard. It's more difficult. It's deeper and heavier than others. But he's saying that we can't let go of that pain in a way that's going to be harmful. We have to use it to, you know, be a purposeful pain. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think, so this reminds me of when I read Dreamland by Sam Quinones, I think is how you pronounce his last name. And he talked about the World Health Organization. I think it was in 96, they declared pain a vital sign. So pain was a vital sign. So you have like your respiration, your heartbeat, you have vital signs to check somebody. So pain being on the vital sign meant that in order to solve, if we had any pain in a patient, right, that from the medical perspective, it was that was something that they didn't need to live with. And their solution for that was to prescribe an opioid. And that's part of what kicked off the opioid epidemic, right? And so when we talk about meaningful pain, it's like, well, it's like, well,
there's no meaningful pain to them. There's no pain as meaningful as what you're
And
saying.
pain,
I think
pain is subjective also.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and as a culture, it's like, is the cultural death of slowly dying because we've isolated ourselves and shut ourselves off completely to pain more painful than the pain that we have to go through? Like, what is the greater pain?
Well, Kurt, what do I like that you mentioned isolation, because what we're seeing really is the implementation of the internet in the home, where we're quote unquote more connected than ever.
Right.
And the toll that's taking on mental health, and this feeling where, like, you know, people are starting to feel more isolated and more alone and feeling that way. And what the answer is connection, but you can't connect the appropriate way. That your body has a different response when you're connecting with somebody in person than when you're connecting with them over the telephone. Right.
It's a biological thing. It's it's totally.
So is the chemical imbalance that you're actually experiencing lack of connection?
I think that's a serious consideration, you know, when we're talking about that. If that's on the scale, you know, psychotropic deaths are on the scale of heroin, then it's like, well, I think that's a serious consideration that needs to be made. That's maybe not being talked about enough, you know?
Yeah, no, that was
well, and
cool.
we've definitely seen a spike in suicide, depression since the pandemic. Which, I mean, I know it's almost cliche. It's almost cliche to even say that, right?
The numbers are saying that it didn't go up for suicide in Alaska, at least, but that's because people were forced to be home. People were out of stressful environments. Of course, we were struggling with the pandemic. I believe there was more attempts, but don't quote me on that. I'll correct that next podcast if I was wrong. But what we're actually seeing is we're seeing the calm before the storm, in a sense, right? Because what we're about to see is that that isolation that now took place for our 6 and 7 year old children, that has yet to have the ripple effect that's coming. And this is what I'm seeing just on the ground level, working with those in prevention stuff. It's like a calm right now, but it's gearing up to be much bigger than that, and something that could potentially be out of hand, because we are going to have those feelings of isolation and those effects that took place over the last 2 years actually greatly start to affect individuals 4 or 5 years after this isolation took place, because some of those young people were forced to be home in abusive situations and forced to be home in less, healthy situations than even their school was, right? If I was 6 or 7 years old in my childhood being forced to be at home, I don't know where I'd be, right? School was my safe place.
And that's always, I don't want to say shocked, but it took me a second to make that connection. My mom works in education. My dad was a teacher for 22 years before working for the governor. And now I work here. I would say that I grew up in a really good home. And for me, the idea of, who wants to be at school, right?
Yeah.
Like, no one wants to be at school, but then I realized there's this whole portion of my peers that to them, you know, maybe they don't want to, you know, no one likes doing homework or doing the minutia of school, but at least for that, you know, 7, 8, I can't remember how long people go to school anymore. I'm out of high school. I graduated. I don't need to worry about it. But like for those 8 hours that you're in school, it's a better situation than going back and being at home. It's a safer situation. Like, especially at the age level that you're talking about where, you know, it's these young kids.
Yeah. Who don't understand. It's the whole life that they understood. So, yeah. So just to elaborate on that, really is like my father was abusive. And actually, right shortly after that, 8 or 9 years old, my dad started to get actual help. They would still argue all the time, but that felt like a peace to me. When your entire life is this uphill fight of like, you know, constant moves and being ripped out of school and put in these situations where like your home life isn't your safe place. You know, you're like in a battlefield at home and then you go to school and, you know, for a couple of those years I was being picked on, but that felt healthier to me, you know, and that's what I don't think that we're really touching on, right? And it comes down to the other conversation that we've had a couple weeks ago about how I believe that we need to help young people understand mental health better.
Right.
You know, it doesn't need to be medications. It doesn't need to be all these things. It needs to be mental health understanding is what me and Kurt are advocating really for, because, or at least I am. Sorry, I didn't mean to put that in your mouth.
No. I mean, I think that's fair. Awareness. Yeah. I mean,
if that's your whole life, how do you know that your life is actually not okay?
Well,
if that's the only existence you've ever known.
Right. Well, and critical thinking on behalf of parents and people that are in positions that where, you know, that how do I want to say this, but that we even though we have experts and people that we go to, that we do our due diligence and take enough responsibility to approach our problems in our families and in our communities from you know, our individual perspective, because there's some truth to lived experience, right? Or me and you wouldn't be doing what we're doing. I mean, we do what we do because we lived through what that is, you know, and I just think that there needs to be, we've gotten away of trusting our intuition and that there's some value in, you know, going through an experience, and that we don't necessarily, you know, I think it's easy. Like I said, I think I said this a couple podcasts ago, but when we're talking about this being a multi-billion-dollar industry, it's like easy to refer to somebody and feel like, okay, I solved the problem because I gave my problem to somebody who is more an expert than me on the subject. But it's like, well, who's more of an expert on you about your life than you are? You know? Yeah, right. I mean,
truth.
I mean, and I'm not saying that
you're
don't
the
reach
only
out.
one who has
right.
to. You're the only one who knows.
I'm not saying don't reach out or don't go to certain people for help. All I'm saying is that you have to bounce. It's like getting a second opinion, right? You want to get the opinion from somebody for something, like whether it's your doctor, your mechanic, from somebody that you trust, that you go to all the time. But sometimes you want a second opinion because it's not every one person knows everything about any given field or any given thing. And, you know, you want to make an informed decision and practice some critical thinking. I think that it's, you know, the direct to consumer advertising, the constant cultural pressure to be like productive has created this atmosphere where, like, for some people, they feel like, you know, that, you know, from our culture perspective, that's what's normal, right? That's you know, you defer something, but, you know, whose best interest does anybody, at the end of the day, you always have your own best interest in mind. So I think people have to create time to check in with themselves, I guess is what I'm saying, you know?
Yeah, check in with yourself. That is I mean, if we could end it on anything else, checking in with yourself is probably the biggest thing that you can take away from this. Listen back to it. There's a lot of information that we just gave you guys, and we're going to continue this conversation as we move forward. But thank you guys for tuning in to Diagnonsense. My name is Justin Pendergrass, and I'm here with Kurt Honak. You have anything else, Kurt?
No, I just a lot of good stuff happening in our community, and we love to have you come down and check us out.
Yeah, definitely. And if you guys have any topics or anything that you would like us to touch on in the future, we are happy to ignore them.
Or you can send them to Isaac, that's ISAAC, at myhousematsu.org, and then we'll ignore them.
Yeah.
Then we'll ignore them.
But do the work.
Yeah. We actually, I think, that what we referenced kind of earlier, I'm really excited for what we have coming up, because Kurt is, I don't know if it's because he's in school still, but Kurt has all these like articles and videos that he's constantly sending to us, and the two
we want to talk about them.
The two that he had me watch the other day, I think we could have a really good discussion about psychiatry and religion, spiritual bypass. It's all, I'm gonna have to watch them both again. They're too smart for me. But yeah, I mean, this is
definitely tune in the next time we are here. We're gonna be talking about more stuff like that,
and more guests too.
More guests, possibly.
Super exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.